Rembrandt. First, let's read some words by the French essayist Montaigne. He said, I give my soul now one face, now another, according to which direction I turn it. If I speak of myself in different ways, that is because I look at myself in different ways. All contradictions may be found in me. Rembrandt is the soul of a self-portraiture. It's a leading light. He personifies artists and art at their most profound. And if we sometimes speak of him in terms of Shakespeare or late Beethoven, it is because the depths of his humanity, especially in the late self-portraits, seems to have no equal in painting. Think of an artist depicting himself along with the easel, and you must surely think of a Rembrandt. He is the solitary spirit, the lone genius, the hero in a brown study, bearing the marks of life's sufferings with inspirational courage. He is what we should all be when coming to terms with ourselves, when facing our end. The exemplary being, the exemplary artist. For think of old masters, and Rembrandt's comes first, looking out from the tawny shadows of the past, so familiar from the scores of self-portraits that he can be summoned to mind in an instant. Rembrandt looks as he should, as old masters look. His art is one with his face. We would know him anywhere, recognize him in any street. But what did Rembrandt actually look like? His long dead face looks after more than 80 paintings, drawings, and prints, beginning with the smooth-faced student and running all the way to the hard-up old veteran close to death and burial in an unmarked grave almost 40 years later. It is the longest lifespan of self-portraits ever painted, a record of change and decay unparalleled in the history of art. The Dutch filmmaker Bert Hanstra, commissioned to commemorate the 350th anniversary of Rembrandt's death, took this to its logical conclusion by merging one self-portrait into the next in a chronological order on screen, so that one saw the face starting to sag, the eyes gradually shrinking beneath the creases, and the hair eventually turning wispy and silver. But what color was the hair in the first place? Red, auburn, tawny brown? What shape were the forehead and jaws? Hanstra's film is inconclusive, as it has to be because of Rembrandt's appearance. It's so extraordinarily hard to pin down in the first place. The eyes are hardly ever the same from one picture to the next, wider apart in one decade than another, the famous nose waxing and waning by the year. In the earliest solo image, Rembrandt downplays this nose for a sidelong squint at his own dark-eyed defiance. A few months later, etching himself again, he gives the nose colossal breadth, wide as the mouth itself. Above it, the eyes are two startled black discs, faintly dismayed by what they see in the glass. At 21, Rembrandt is already expressing far more than the facts. The nose expands into a linear muscle, impossibly large, contracts into a narrow and almost elegant nape. The eyes don't just crease with laughter, bulge with tension, or cloud over with care. They actually appear to change color. Rembrandt paints them as dusky ovals, black pools, amber lenses washed with a golden light. They are buttons, sultanas, fish holes in snow. They are as abstract as Mickey Mouse's rectangular peepers. Sometimes Rembrandt avoids mentioning them at all, except as punctuation marks in a flashy expanse that seems to melt into different forms from one self-portrait to another. Perhaps there is a measure of ordinary truth in Rembrandt's mutability. Perhaps this is how we all look to ourselves, week by week, year after year, never the same from one day to the next. Look at the rings. Look at the reams of photographs of Marilyn Monroe through the decade, and she comes and goes, getting closer or further from Andy Warhol's clenching silk screen icon as she loses weight, gains weight, acquires artificial lashes, grows more strained or puffy around the eyes, appears more, but then less like herself. And even though she is the most famous actress of the 20th century, who can remember what her nose looked like? Everyone appreciates the old adage that at 40 you get the face you deserve, which is a presumption of a plasticity finally hardening into place after many years of flux, just as everyone knows the bittersweet fascination of seeing oneself after in a lifetime of photographs, anthologies of one's dead and irrecoverable selves. To see yourself as you were at 20 is to recognize the rudiments of your present face without being able to re-enter the past or take advantage of a hindsight. We live life afterwards, as Kierkegaard laments, but are condemned to understand it backwards. Rembrandt is so young in the first self-portraits, so unformed, that he hardly seems to relate the old chieftain at the end. Yet everyone feels that they recognize him every time. The connection is so deep and immediate. The sense of intimacy, Rembrandt's perpetual gift, and crucial to this perceived familiarity. He may be a boastful boy from Leyden posing in a flashy steel collar, or a shrunken old Lear in a threadbare cap. And still you would know this was Rembrandt. Every self-portrait convinces you that this is the truth about him, the faithful expression of the man as he was. How remarkable that he can make you feel this, not once, but time after time, that if you saw his self-portraits altogether, as one possible with the unprecedented show in 1999, you would feel that all the changes were somehow true to his nature as well as his physiognomy. That for Rembrandt, an immense variety of character goes with a whole range of life-altered looks, that having multiple personalities is the human condition, in which sense Hannestra's attempt to unify Rembrandt's face by looking at eyes of self-portraits in the same position on screen is a travesty of everything this might have come to represent. That we change and lose our past faces is both agonizing and the commonest thing in the world. It is beyond belief that this great priest of humanity never had this in mind as he painted himself, instead and gradually decline. For if we feel this, then how could he not? Rembrandt, our Shakespeare, our contemporary. Except that Rembrandt has no sense of self. Self-awareness has not yet been invented. This at least has been the steady assertion of some very eminent scholars over the years who insist, pretty much against the entire body of self-portraiture from Jean van Eyck onwards, that artists before the 19th century cannot possibly be conscious of, still less actively contemplating their inner selves. This was the curatorial principle for Rembrandt by himself, that once-in-a-lifetime show, that while some might fancifully believe in Rembrandt's self-portraits as a form of self-scrutiny, a search for identity, the artist coming to terms with himself, the paintings were in fact stimulated by the market and commerce, that the term self-portraits did not exist in Rembrandt's day is submitted as proof, as if concepts cannot exist without the framework of language. Before the 19th century, such images were described as pictures or likenesses of artists by their own hand. Then all of a sudden, the new term self-portrait appears, because from the end of the 18th century, the experience of one's own individuality was very different to that current in Rembrandt's century. Rembrandt is not the only one who couldn't possibly have had any sense of his own personality. Even Montaigne's marvelous essays on his inner self, mind, and more should not likewise be confused with a romantic individualist desire for self-knowledge. In the interests of a demonologizing self-portraiture, it has even been asserted that artists in Rembrandt's day did not step to the mirror with questions and doubts, but with a carefully planned program. Anyone tempted to believe this assertion might start by consulting Annibale Carrocci's profoundly doubting self-portrait from the same period. Scholars often reflect the society of their own time, despite being otherwise so leery of anarchianism. So perhaps it is no coincidence that the Rembrandt of the late 20th century turned out to be a model of advanced capitalism. He has to develop new products, evolve new forms of portraiture to meet the demands of the new middle classes of the nascent Dutch Republic, has to thrive in a highly competitive market where every town has its local painter, and every profession from banker to orthopedic surgeon wants to be depicted, needs must, even when it comes to portraying oneself. Of course, Rembrandt had to survive, and his interest in getting and spending has long been attested. From the letters requesting ever higher prices for his pictures to the purchase of a prodigiously expensive house in Amsterdam that brought him to financial ruin. It is also true and unarguably important that Rembrandt's self-portraits were sold during the artist's lifetime. Documents show that 3 were in famous collection, one of them belonging to Charles I of England before the artist was after his 20th, and his self-portrait prints were in high demand as patrons vied to complete their set of Rembrandt's etching. When the artist went under in 1656, and all his possessions from clothes to studio props and even little sketches by his son Titus were inventoried by rapturous brokers, not a single self-portrait appeared on the list as still in the studio unsold. But if Rembrandt's self-portrait was so successful, one might have expected him to repeat them, as he so often did with other kinds of a picture, instead of resolutely avoiding the temptation. Those who regard his self-portraits as product, albeit superior product, aren't inclined to notice their evolving originality, or to concede that they might be enriched by insight or exceptionally depth of personality. Faced with such incomparable painting, these experts retreat into issues of quantity, asking why he painted so many self-portraits rather than how, and the answers given are ruthlessly impersonal, as a way of practicing facial expressions for subsequent pictures, as a standard type of self-advertisements, as a model for painting figures from Bible and myth, as well as especially characters of the artist's own invention, even just for the humdrum reason of adding to the popular stocks of images of a famous man that etchers would turn out in printed anthologies, and which by now included not just philosophers and kings, but artists all the way from Raphael to Rubens. When Rembrandt stepped to the mirror, it seems that he saw money. There may be some truth in these claims, though we do not know of a single Rembrandt self-portrait that was painted for the market, and it does not follow that because a painting was sold, it must have been made expressly for sale. Nor does the discovery that these images were passing from one collector to another quite early in his career, and not piling up in the studio as once thought, mean that they had no private or personal meaning for him. The economic and professional functions of pictures are not the only motivations painters have for making them, and others arise, beyond doubt, in the process. Rembrandt left no documents about his self-portraits, and there is no record of him saying anything about them. Although this puts him in the company of practically every self-portraitist who has ever lived, for some scholars, it is a proof positive that they cannot have meant much to their market. Yet for all that has been written about Rembrandt, very little is known about his views on art of any kind. We know he bought Durer's prints, admired Leonardo and Titian, and Raphael's portrait of Baudelaire, Castiglione, which he copied when it was up for sale in Amsterdam, and then emulated in a self-portrait etched not many weeks later. But he did not theorize, or if he did, his ideas have been lost except for a meager 6 words whose meaning is still in dispute. What he aimed for in his work, Rembrandt wrote to a patron, was to produce this in Latin or maybe Dutch language, the meaning, the greatest and most natural moment. But whether he meant the movement of bodies and faces or souls is unclear. Perhaps he was aiming to move our emotions. The last word has also been translated as emotion, and Rembrandt's gift for conveying feeling was famous in his own lifetime. His patron, the poet and composer Constantine Huygens, declares in his memoirs that Rembrandt's uncommon ability to portray emotions is already widely extolled. Huygens' autobiography, moreover, contains a passage that goes right against the line that nobody has any awareness of their inner being in the 17th century. Huygens had commissioned Jean Levens, Rembrandt's professional partner in Leiden, to paint his portrait, but reports that everyone criticized the finished picture for being too somber, a contemplative rendering that detracts from the vivacity of my mind. Yet the gloom in his face was true, and something the poet has hoped in vain to suppress. During this period, I was involved in a serious family affairs of some importance, and, as is only to be expected, the cares which I endeavored to keep to myself were clearly reflected in the expression of my face and eyes. Huygens admired the perspicacity of Levens almost as much as Rembrandt. If no sources exist other than the paintings themselves, from which to deduce Rembrandt's sense of self, there's plenty of documentary evidence of him as a man who drove hard against society and its standards. It is well known that more than half of the members of the militia who paid to see respectable likeness of their faces in the night watch were appalled to find themselves summarily reduced to profile or crepuscular sideline. At least one powerful patron rejected his portrait altogether, and Rembrandt was habitually late, wayward, and defiant. From the 1640s, as taste changed to the smoother Flemish style and the classicism of Poussin, Rembrandt began to lose prestige, but still did not alter his approach to suit the changing market. One of his earliest biographers, Filippo Bodolinici, drawing on the testimony of Rembrandt's pupils, says that after it had become commonly known that whoever wanted to be portrayed by him had to sit for him for some 2 or 3 months, there were few who came forward. Van Dyck, by contrast, could paint a client in a morning. Another biographer, Arnold Houbenriken, tells of Rembrandt's irrepressible individualism. The artist had been laboring for ages on a family portrait and was nearly finished when his pet monkey died. To the family's horror, he chose to commemorate the beloved creature by introducing its corpse into the painting, an effect that so impressed him that rather than remove it to satisfy his clients, he left the work unfinished. Art before money, monkeys before clients. We expect a certain consistency of behavior and thought among our higher beings that we do not require of ourselves, that the artist capable of bringing forth the Jewish bride or Blizzard's feast or the anatomy lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tope would not easily submit to the convention feels apart. Our ideal, in fact, of the proto-romantic artist. One wants to believe that Rembrandt knew his own worth, that his eventual poverty was as proudly borne as his late self-portraits are brief, and it is gratifying to learn that he sometimes behaved as though he was the country's only great painter. The early self-portraits may declare their own originality for strategic purpose, quite possibly for money, But the late self-portraits go away beyond those functions. The standard account of Rembrandt's self-portraits is that they amount to an autobiography in paint. You see him as a truculent youth in Leyden, posing in the soldier's collar he has no real right to wear, or trying to outdo Caravaggio in spectacular lighting. As a young star nearly translated to Amsterdam as the money starts to come in, wearing a gold chain or with ostentatious feathers in his cap. You see him as a well-fed husband dandling his wife on his knee, messing about with the fancy dress trunk for portraits and self-portraits alike, as a successful businessman in furs, and even once or twice as a prosperous Dutch burgher. Then widowed, very and even perhaps a little shamefaced, as some claim, after having one mistress locked up in a house of correction, while taking up with another, much younger lover. After a mysterious gap of nearly a decade, he returns as the bankrupted old sage, overextended, out of favor, increasingly isolated as he afterlives not just his father, mother, and wife, but both of his mistresses and his only child, Titus. In the late self-portraits, in his lonely and beleaguered 60s, when there are no more students to teach and no more collectors at the studio door, he drops the make-believe of the youthful self-portraits for the honest scrutiny and celebrated depth. It would be inhuman not to perceive some sort of a life story in these pictures, not least because they so evidently follow, to a certain degree, the trajectory of our own lives. The arc from aspiration to achievement and then to retirement, from intensity to profundity. The 7 ages of man minus the mewling infant and the schoolboy. If Rembrandt sometimes dressed up as an actor in costume, a Turkish potentate in gleaming tassels and a turban, St. Paul in prison holding one of his letters to the Ephesians, the painter king in golden robes with a scepter, it is because his life, our lives, are surely experienced as a drama. Performance is a perfect metaphor. When Rembrandt appears in theatrical darkness, it is not to invent an exchange with the viewer. His is strictly an actor's monologue from the other side of the limelight. At 33, he leans on a wall, beret rakishly angled, magnificently dressed, but in no sense conversing over the fence. 10 years later, squaring up with defiance, full frontal with hands on hips, making a comeback after the longest absence, he defies you to say anything about it. Even at the very end, he does not stoop to discourse. These late paintings are monuments of silence, dark and knotted images that close in on the face, with all those sad stories of the deaths of kings in the eyes. They make you feel you are seeing an old man, himself, in person as well as in painting. They are all candor and truth, and from them we learn what it feels to be old. if we do not already know it. And in Rembrandt's case, what it is to be prematurely aged by grief and disappointment, to grow puffy and weak, to have to squint because your vision is losing power and your eyes are sinking into their sockets. Rembrandt's in the dying yellow light, the last life in his eyes, makes himself felt in the brushwork, distressed, gnawed, and haphazard, perfunctory, thickening in winning skins, or wearing paper thin, as if the paintings themselves were on the way out. We are so used to thinking of these images as unimpeachably honest, their intensity the very measure of that candor, that we tend to see them as straight and unstaged compared to the earlier self-portraits. But Rembrandt, young and old, is always in performance. Take two early showstoppers, the self-portraits in Amsterdam and Munich, where Rembrandt is a lone soul in the forest of the night, his eyes black than the darkness around him. He has drawn back from the single shaft of light, deftly positioning himself at the exact boundary between brightness and darkness, where the light catches his smooth cheek and the flashy of white lace, showing off his already superb ability to make flesh and fabric tangible, but obscuring his features, allowing his true face, his true self, to remain unreachable. It cannot have been easy to make himself out in the mirror from such deep shadow, let alone paint in such lighting conditions, if indeed he did, rather than making some of it up. The dazzle is in the staging, yet the staging is all concealment. You have to search for the artist in the picture, and when you find him, there is the shock that he already had you inside. These two paintings were made within months of each other, and at the same time as a sequence of etchings, where Rembrandt pulls faces, turns suddenly, looks shocked, goes into a peculiar fugue state, where his eyes shrink to sightless dots. He is young and cocky, he is old and past it. In no time at all, he is inexplicably aged. Pulling his cloak about himself, he shows forward a mug, so blank it is almost aggressively vacuous. Rembrandt is never sociable, appearing only once in company with his wife Saskia, and he makes considerable play of his solitude, coming forward to a fraction, but then looking away, or retreating into tantalizing shadow. There is no attempt to ingratiate. The paint at every stage rises to the level of a performance. People came from across Europe to see his alchemy, the way he could turn paint into gold with a few irregular knobs of impasto that picked up the light, the way he could make an incisive contour with a casual swipe. He applied paint so thickly you could pick his portraits up by the nose. It was sad, and so complex were the effects, so persuasive the illusion. Some contemporary saw his paintings as sorcery. In fact, his brushwork is everywhere revealed, particularly in the self-portraits, where he makes the paint mimic precisely the grain and stubble and sort hung of flesh. The paint folds and creases beneath the eyes. The nose is a pile up of marks, mounding into a pocket tip. Tear ducts are devots in impasto. He uses the brush handle to etch tendrils of hair into still wet paint, smears the pigment with his fingers, scumbles and smudges it to get the tangible surface of life. He fashions this face, this human clay, and he shows himself making it up. And making himself up too as he goes along in a sustained act of improvisation. He adopts the pose of Rubens' self-portrait, then Titian's Man with a Sleeve. He transforms himself into a snoring beggar. He dresses up as an Oriental, even orientalizing his own features while still recognizably Rembrandt. The face, or at least the painted face, is so plastic from one self-portrait to the next that all you could say for certain is that Rembrandt looks Dutch. But where the performance was one signaled with props, costumes, and poses, in the late self-portraits it is more apparent in a violent contrasts. When you compare the Edinburgh self-portrait with the self-portrait as Zeux's roughly 2 years later, there is so little relationship between them. You feel they can hardly be the same man. In the first, he is deeply pensive, a look of wintry self-scrutiny in the eyes. In the second, where he is apparently coming on as the legendary Greek painter Zeuxis, who died of a mirth, his face is a frightening raptures of empty laughter. Compared to switching roles between beggar and Turk, the psychological distance between these late self-portraits feels so much greater. Nothing settles, nothing resolves. The sufferings of a lifetime don't lead to peace and a united front to the world. Rembrandt seems to be the oldest old masters. It is strange to think that Caravaggio was already dead before he was born, and that Velázquez is his senior. Yet though he appears as old as time, he is very generation's soulmate. This timeless is not an illusion. Rembrandt deliberately painted himself after time, set himself free of the moment. Compare any of his self-portraits with a portrait by his contemporary, Frans Hals, and you will see two different ways of picturing time. Hals catches the moment with the flashing depths and spots so admired by the Impressionists. His sitters are in the here and the now, leaning after the picture, turning and laughing, equally struck to see you. Rembrandt's avoids spontaneity. His self-portraits are manifestly premeditated. They don't catch time so much as stop it altogether. He endures through the centuries.